Well, hello there, David Taylor or Mr Pelargonium, back with another video for the Pelargonium and Geranium Society. Do you know, I think it's time we concluded the compost trial that I started in May of last year. So let's get going. Well, hello there. It's great to see you again. I thought it was time that we concluded the compost trial that I began. I did a video in early May of last year. That's when it was published, 3rd of May, I've actually just checked. So I thought it was time that we concluded the trials that I was doing. I mean, I was trialing basically the existing peat-based composts that were around at the time, as well as a lot of the newer peat-free composts. Now, obviously, I've done this trial on the basis that in the UK, peat-based composts are not available to the amateur from more or less the start of this year. From 2024, they're not available to buy in sort of retail shops. So the amateur can no longer get hold of peat-based composts, and indeed the nursery trade can only get peat-based composts, I think, for another 2 years. I think they're trying to sort of bring it back. It was originally 2030, I think I said in the original video, which you can find up here, by the way. I put another link up there to my original video. So there's very much a move away from peat-based compost even for the nursery trade. Now in Europe, they're probably doing a similar thing. I think it's more or less in line, not sure of the dates with regard to individual countries, with regard to the retail sale of it to amateurs. But obviously going further afield, I can't really comment on the availability of peat-based composts and also the peat-free composts. I would have thought that the majority of countries now are sort of beginning to go down the route of using peat-free compost, but I really can't qualify that. I wouldn't know. So there's a good chance that you may still be able to widely obtain peat-based composts. Any of the trade names or the products I'm mentioning here today are purely ones that I'm using of my own choice. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies at all. No sponsorship going on there whatsoever. These are purely purchases that I've made on my own back and that I use for my own purposes. Now, I have got a bit of scripting here going on because there's a few things to talk about and I didn't want to forget them all. So you may remember initially I did a couple of sort of follow-up videos. I did one initially talking about a John Innes formula that was peat-free. I'll just link up to that now. You can have a look at that. But that was one of the first failings. I actually stopped using that after a few weeks because I found that mix chronically difficult to work with. It seemed very dry. The actual little lumps of loam in it for the loam-based content of the John Innes to be very solid. It was impossible to work with. It was very awful formulation, which you can see just in the video there that I just highlighted. And I stopped using that within a couple of weeks. So we'll sort of almost bypass that one to say that peat-free John Innes I just don't think is very good at all. I think generally it's far easier to make your own mixtures for growing pelargoniums, whether that be in big pots or small pots. It's far easier to be able to formulate your own mix, and that's what I will be talking about here a great deal. Now, in that initial video, I did actually pull out the use of the Humex Original, a pure peat-based compost that I used to use, and that was, I think, the absolute perfection of composts. I used to mix a little bit of perlite in with it, about 3 to 1, 3 parts of the compost to 1 part of perlite, and that made a lovely light compost. The zonals loved it because I generally find, and I suppose I can say this now, The zonals, I find, prefer a lighter mix of compost, whereas what I call the more sort of slightly hardier geraniums, they're not hardy, but they're a bit tougher. The regals, the uniques, the scentids and those types of plants prefer a slightly denser compost, so something with a little bit of loam in it, which is why I always used to use the John Innes #2 formula, mixed with a little bit of perlite, again about 3 to 1, which was the other main mix that I used to use for those types of plants, for the regals, the uniques and the scentids. Whereas zonals, I've always found prefer the lighter compost, which is why they used to love the Humex. So realistically, I'm not going to talk too much about the use of the Humex because you can't get it anymore. I can't get hold of it anywhere. Or a peat-based JI, because again, from this year, you cannot get hold of that. You could up till 2023, but that's the end of it now. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the use of those because I've been using them for years and never had any issues whatsoever. Now I've got some samples here of sort of peat-free compost. Now in my original video I did speak about the Melcourt Silver Grow, which is a really top quality compost, peat-free compost that's used in the nursery trade as well. It's based on coir and ground down wood fibre. And it's it's very consistent, it's very good quality. And I originally was mixing that 6 parts of the Silver Grow with 1 part perlite and 1 part of sand, sort of just coarse sand, horticultural sand. But in my early days of experimenting with that, I did find that it did get dry relatively quick. I also found that it needed, the roots weren't really getting down into the pots that quickly. And that was something that Humex, the peat-based compost that I used to use, provided. The roots used to go through it like a jet. They used to really fire through it and were coming out the base in 5 minutes. But they weren't doing that with this. So that was something that I was going to have to think about. Now, as time went on, the Silver Grow brand from Melcourt, they brought out their base mix, but with added John Innes. Now, the John Innes formulation is always a bit of slightly weird one. I think, again, I did mention this in the original video because John Innes, the original John Innes mix was a formulation which included peat. So it's all slightly weird that we're now talking about with added John Innes, but of course it's not going to include peat. So what are they actually adding? Presumably, some kind of peat replacement. And that has clearly got a little bit of sand in it. You can clearly see this. It's clearly got a bit of sand into it. It does seem to me to retain a little bit more moisture. That's what I would say. And it doesn't dry out. And I think going forward, I will almost be certainly using this in place of the Silver Grow original, the original Silver Grow. I think that potentially just dries out too much. Whereas this, with a little bit of sand in it, a little bit of sort of additional formulation, maybe there's a little tad of loam in it. It's not exactly clear what the proportions are. But I think going forward, this will be the one that I will use in various mixes, which we'll talk about in a moment. I find using these composts on their own, it is a little bit hit and miss. The zonals, I think, prefer it, but I find the plants that prefer a slightly denser compost, like the regals, scentids and uniques that I mentioned earlier, prefer something a little bit tougher to get their roots into, and so the topsoil really comes into play at that point. So, sort of coming to the conclusion, so I added a little bit more Silver Grow, took some Silver Grow away, added a bit more topsoil, took some topsoil away, to conclude that the final mix that I'm going to end up with is something along these lines. And as I've said, this is what sort of has ended up working for me. So, I mean, I can only really give this as a guide. And realistically, you're going to need to experiment yourself to find your perfect mixes for your plants. Right, so my conclusion is that I do two parts of the ordinary silver grow, the light one there. 2 parts of the John Innes silver grow. I do 1 part of topsoil and then 1 part of perlite and a sort of half part of sand. I mean, that's a bit of a rough guide. I mean, for the regals, I just slightly change the density. For the regals, I go 1 part of the ordinary silver grow, 2 parts of the John Innes silver grow, 2 parts of topsoil, and 1 part of perlite, and again just a sort of half part of sand just put into that total. So that's the conclusion that I've come to, that is the best formulation for my plants, and that's where they seem to be growing, really, relatively well. So I think that's a good replacement. Now, the one caveat that I will put into that is that I think that I almost certainly in the future will be going over to just using the silver grow with added John Innes, because I think the normal silver grow is just a little bit too light, whereas there is just a little bit of density to the silver grow with the JI. And I think going forward, I probably will only buy the silver grow with the added JI, because I think it's just got a little bit more coarseness to it. And there's obviously a little bit of loam in there with it, and a little bit of sand, probably almost certainly silver sand in with it as well. So that's the conclusion to the very basic trial that I've done on these new composts. Now we've got a fair number of considerations to take in. It depends how serious a grower you are, but the one thing I will say is that the silver grow products, the Melcourt silver grow products, they are expensive. There's no doubt about it. Certainly compared to good old-fashioned peat-based composts. I mean, they're about 11 or 12 pounds a pack, which for, I think it's only a 60-litre pack, the slightly larger ones. It is quite expensive. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So the question out of that is, are there cheaper alternatives? And the answer to that is there is, obviously. Most of the garden centre chains do their own composts, and there are a host of other peat-free composts that there are available to buy. The one thing that I will say about those, though, is that some of them are very, very, very questionable quality. And I'll give you an example of that now, because I'll put in a clip, but I've got some here. I did actually touch on this realistically over in the early video that I did, but some of these composts that are sold, just generally, this is my own observation, it should be said, it's almost like they are made of grass clippings, and how you're meant to grow plants in this type of soil, I have got no idea. Now, the only one thing that I would say is that, if you're on a slightly, tighter budget, all I would perhaps suggest you do is get topsoil to mix in with this compost, or even maybe, use a bit of your own, say, fairly good quality garden soil to mix up with this. How you're meant to grow plants in this kind of substance, I really don't know. But as I said, if you mix that up with a bit of topsoil, probably 50-50, you're probably going to get a compost where your plants will grow, sort of fairly well. So that's sort of all I can say about that. You just got to be very careful what you're buying with these peat-free composts. And sort of talking almost about the sort of the cheaper end of the market, but also with the silver grows and all of these peat-free composts, is that the main thing about them is that they do dry out quicker. than the old-fashioned peat-based composts. That's a really big consideration. I mean, it's all right, sort of, we're all moving over to the peat-based compost and we're all meant to be supposedly sort of saving water and not using water. But if you're using these types of compost, you're going to be using more water. There's absolutely no doubt about that. These do dry out quicker. Obviously, adding the topsoil element is going to sort of slow up that process, and in a way that's what adding this topsoil has also done. It's made them act a little bit more like the old-fashioned peat-based compost, but it's a real consideration to think about. The plants do dry out quicker. Now, the other thing you're going to need to consider with these peat-free composts is that they're usually very dark, and they do not show a great deal of difference when they're wet, between them being very wet and very dry. So you're going to have to go over to sort of seeing the weight of your pot really as to whether it's heavy or whether it's dry to determine whether it actually needs a water. The old peat-based compost, of course, used to show, they used to be much lighter when they dried out. And that sort of almost certainly meant they needed a water. But these peat-free composts are very dark, and they stay dark whether they're wet or whether they're dry. So that's one of the other considerations you're going to have to note. As well as the watering, the only other main thing that I really do need to get over is that once you've got your plants in your compost, 80% of what happens once you've got that plant growing is down purely to plant management. I mean, 80% is a bit of a guess, but I'm just giving the example that a lot of the growth is down to how you manage the plants and how you grow them on, how you water them, how you feed them. Very important with pelargoniums, as I've always mentioned. You know, how you overwinter them, you know, keep them relatively dry and all that kind of thing, which I struggle with in this greenhouse to a certain extent. But all of the plant management and growth techniques, much of which I discuss throughout the year, is what makes the plants sort of function and grow on to their best ability. The compost is really just their root anchor, you know, what their roots are doing is obviously very, very important into how they grow, which is why I've always mentioned in the past that feeding, liquid feeding, is so very, very important for pelargoniums, because this mix that we're formulating and I've sort of potentially recommended in my conclusions here is just really what is the anchor and what is going to enable those roots to take up the water and feed that we're giving them. So I can't get over that enough. It's plant management which is really the key. So I think I mentioned that in the original video as well. So what we grow them in it gives them the basis and looks after the roots, but what we sort of feed those roots with and how we grow them and water management in particularly with pelargoniums is one of the keys. And as I say, I do lots of videos about all that kind of thing throughout the year. So there we are. I think we're just about concluded there, and I think that rounds this off fairly well. If you've got any questions, just chuck them in the comments below, and I'm sure I'll be able to help you out. So that ties this one up, and I'll hopefully see you again with another video in the near future. Bye-bye for now.